Okay, this video is going to demonstrate how you can achieve a single page layout in a WordPress theme. So rather than go through step by step creating this from scratch, I'm just going to show you the finished product, but I'll step through all the various components of it and show you what you need to do to make this work. So this is what it looks like. As opposed to having a whole bunch of different pages for my content, I've got it outputting everything on just a single long home page. So there's all my content there. So I've got what I had as the content for my home page. I've got my two category sections for the dogs and cats. Then I've got a third category section for my blog, which is formatted differently. And then finally another page for the About Me. And I've gotten rid of the sidebar, not because I can't have it, but you normally don't see them on this style of layout, but there's no reason why you couldn't add it back in. The other thing you normally see on this style of layout is that the links here will link directly to the various different sections, and a lot of the time you see it will scroll like this. So that's achieved with JavaScript, and I'll show you how to do that. And you'll also notice usually because it's a very long page and it takes a while to scroll back up the top, that there's usually a link that's always visible that will allow you to quickly go back to the top like that. Okay, so I'll show you basically how this is all put together. So there's a few things that go into this, but the first big difference that I guess is obvious is that we do have all of the content outputting. So what was previously several different pages or several different templates, this is all now combined into one template. So that's the first thing I guess to discuss, and pretty much everything now is contained within my front page .php template. And so this looks a little different, but it's basically doing the same thing in that it's outputting post content, but it's doing it multiple different times and outputting different content each time. So if we go through, so basically there's going to be a big loop structure in here, and you can see this here. Here's a for each loop, and basically the code within here is going through and modifying the query, so modifying what it's requesting WordPress get from the database and then outputting it. So in this case it will request the front page content, then it requests the dogs category, outputs that, then it will request the cats category, outputs all of those posts, then it will request the blog category, output all of those posts, and then finally it requests the About Me page and outputs that. Okay, and then around that, obviously, it's still got the header and the footer. So that's what this loop here is doing. Now, the bit at the top here, is it's calling a function called WP get nav menu items for the main menu. So it's basically requesting from WordPress the contents of this menu and some information about that menu, and I'm doing that because I'm basically feeding the query for each of these different bits of content from the information that's contained within this menu. So what I'm doing is, as you can see in this for each loop, I'm basically going through each of those menu items and then pulling out information from those menu items to set up the custom query for each content section. So first of all there'll be the home section, then the dogs, the cats category, the blog. We skip over this one because this is an external link. Okay, and then finally the About Me page. So I could, if I had wanted to, hard-coded the categories and the post IDs into the WordPress query if I want, but this way, by doing it this way, by using the information that's returned from this WP get nav menu items function, I can still rely on the flexibility of having this WordPress menu. So I could go back now and add more items to this menu, or take away items from it, and without having to change my template, it would output the content from those new items, or remove the ones from the removed items. So it's a little bit more complex than hard coding it, but it gives us much more flexibility, and I think is the best way of doing it. So that's what this part does here. I might skip over that for a moment and just talk about this bit here. So this really is probably the most important line of this template, and this is where we modify the WordPress query. So this is something we haven't looked at before because we've just used the default query. So when it loads up a template, or when you load up a particular URL, let's say it's going to a page, then we just use the default query, which will return us that page content. If we're going to a URL which loads up a category template, then in the past we've just used the default query, which returns all the posts that are contained within that category. And so in our WordPress loop, so if we look at one of these loops, we would have just used these functions here. So the post function, and the permalink, and the post thumbnail, and the post content, or the content and the title. All of those functions, they all access the default query. So we've never had to worry about modifying the query before. But in order to get this to work, because we essentially need multiple queries in the one template, then that's why we have to have this line here. So we do this by modifying a global variable, global just meaning it can be accessed by any script in our template. It's a global variable called WP query, and we do that by creating a new instance of this WP query object, and then giving it some arguments or some parameters, and those parameters tell the query what content to return. Okay, and so I'll return to that in a moment. So that's the most important part of this. And then there's some more conditional code here, which I'll skip over, and I'll come down to really the second very important part of this template, which is this line here, which says include. So it's an include call. It's like a require call that we've seen before. So it's actually including a PHP file, and then we use this function called locate template, which is a WordPress function, which basically will point us to a PHP file, and it's forming the name of that PHP file by starting with, in this case, loop and then a dash, and then adding on the contents of this variable template part, which I'll discuss more in a little bit, and then finally the .php extension. But basically what this line is doing is depending on which menu item it is that we're at, depending on which menu item we're currently looking at a given iteration of this loop, okay, it will go and add a different template depending on what content we're outputting. So if you notice over here, I've got some new files, and they all start with this loop prefix. Now, they don't have to start with that. I've just done that so that I can easily identify these as separate from my other standard template files. So as you can see here, I've got a few of these. I've got a loop for outputting a page, and this, if you compare this with my old, let's say the index template, then it's pretty much exactly the same except minus the header and the footer. Other than that, it's go back here, loop page. Other than that, it's simply again just HTML with some PHP and the standard PHP loop. So it still has the while condition with the have post, and then calling the post function outputs the title, the content, the time, the author, and whatever else I want to output here. But the point is, these will retrieve different values depending on how we've modified the go back to the front page here, depending on how we've modified the default query by this line here. So essentially, so essentially the two steps are, we loop through all of the menu items, and the first step is we modify the query, so we tell WordPress what content to go and get, and then we include a different template file into this main template file to output the content in the format that we want for each of those different content sections. So as you can see, I've got a loop for the blog to output, a loop for what I'm calling the category gallery, which essentially is either this dog's gallery or this cat's gallery. I've got a loop for this one called loop front page, is the template part which will output this first section, so what was originally just on my front page, and then loop page will output this page section here for the about me, and then loop blog is the template part to output this blog section here. Okay, so they all essentially do the same thing. They're all a WordPress loop. They just output the content how I want them to output for that part. And all of these are really just what was previously the separate template files for these sections, but with the header and the footer stripped out. Okay, so we'll go back to the front page.php template here, and I'll go into a bit more detail about this. So I'll explain this part next. So this is the part inside of that for loop where we're looping through each of the menu items, where we basically set up the parameters to pass this WP query object to tell WordPress which content we want for that particular section. So if we look at our menu, basically there's three different types of content that these menu items point to. The home, okay, which is this top part, and the about me section both point to a page type. So in those queries, WordPress is going to request a page. The dogs and the cats section they're both categories. They're going to request posts from a category, and in fact the blog is also a category. So they're also posts, they're just formatted differently using a different part template. And then the third is this external link here, and that one I'm actually ignoring because it's an external link. I don't have to create a template for it. So really the only two that I need to worry about are the page type and the category type. So that's essentially what this if statement here is doing. So in the menu items that get returned by this WP get nav menu items function, and you can look at this function in the WordPress documentation if you want. It will tell you what it does, and it shows you here the object that it returns with all the information about each menu section or each menu item. And so one of these bits of information that it returns is a parameter called object, and so as you can, I should be able to see that here, object. Okay, and that will say what type of content that post links to. So if it's the case that a menu item links to a category like this dogs, cats, or blog section, then that's going to have a value of category, this string here, category. Okay, so I can say, basically I can say if the menu item is linking to a category, then I can set up the query arguments in a certain way. Otherwise, set up the query arguments in another way. In this case, to point to a page. So these are the two different types of menu items that I was talking about before. So the first one is if the menu item is a category, then create this argument variable where we set this parameter. So we set this parameter cat equals something, and this will be a number, and this will be a number that represents that category, and we can get that number that corresponds to that menu item again by pulling out this bit of information from that menu item variable called menu item object ID. Okay, so that will allow us to do that, and then we tell it that the post type that we want is a post. So whenever there's a category, okay, the content that is going to output is a post. These are all posts. Okay, and then the alternative, whereby it's page or anything but a category, we set up the argument and we say that this p variable, and that p stands for post ID or page ID. Okay, and again we pull out the menu items object ID, and we set, in this case, the post type to be a page. Okay, and then my two different queries that I'm going to need to either pull out a page information or a category information. Okay, so now where did I get these bits of information from? Well, if you look up the WP query function reference or class reference in the WordPress documentation, you'll see it talk about all of the different parameters that you can tell WordPress or use to modify the content that WordPress gives you with the WP query object. So as you can see here, it's got examples where you can say, give me just the content where the author's ID is this number here, for example. And then you can see here it talks about categories. Further down it talks about posts and pages. So this information's all in here. So I've gone through and I've figured that out, and I've pulled out the appropriate ones for this example. So once we've got that, once we've established the correct arguments, args variable to send to this WP query constructor function, then that's when we actually use this line. So this is where we're actually modifying the main query, telling it to give us certain information. And so you can follow the logic through and say if it's the first, let's say it's the first menu item, which is home here. Now home links to a page. Okay, this, if I look in the WordPress backend, is going to be a content item that is a page. So it will come through the loop for that first item, and it will get to this if statement. We'll say if menu item object equals category, that is false. Okay, it's not a category, it's a page, so we'll go to this one, and it will set up this arguments variable such that this p parameter is equal to this menu item object ID, and that will be whatever this page's internal numerical ID is for WordPress, and then we'll set the post type to be a page. Okay, and then it will take that args variable and it will send it along with this call to new WP query, so that once this line is executed with those arguments, it will send us back, okay, essentially the page with the page ID that corresponds to that menu item. Okay, and then the next one would be the category dog. So it would come through, okay, and it would say if the menu item object is a category, in this case it's true, we'll create this arguments variable, set the category parameter to be, again, the ID that corresponds to that menu item, so the ID for the dogs category, and it would set the post type to be post. Okay, and then it would execute this line here where it actually creates a new query and modifies the main global WP query variable. Now I should just mention here that you'll see this arguments parameter written in one of two ways. A lot of the time you'll see it written like this, for example, so as a string. Okay, that's one way of doing it, but you can also do it as an array, for example here, and they both essentially do the same thing. I just find that when you've got multiple variables, it's easier to keep track of them by creating them as an array, and that's why I've done it in this example. But for example, I could have written this as a query argument that's something like cat equals, and then whatever that number would have been, and post type equals post, for example. Okay, so I could have written that the same way. Okay, but I've just done it this way because I think it's a bit easier to keep track of everything. Okay, so far we've gotten down to here. So this section basically determines how to tell WordPress what content that we want. Now this next part is all about figuring out, depending on, again, the link or the content that's being returned, which one of these loop part templates to include, so that it outputs the content in the correct format, so that we're matching the content with the appropriate part template. So this again is another conditional statement, and basically there's, what have we got here? There's 1, 2, 3, 4. Looks like 1, 2, 3, 4. Yes. Okay. So there's four different loop partial templates here, and there's a conditional statement which basically tests certain conditions to figure out which one should be included. So the first test I do is to say, well, I call this function, WordPress function called isCategory, and that will return true if basically I've clicked on either this link here, or this link here. So any of those links that actually link to a category. So if that's the case, then I do a further test to see if the category is the blog category, in which case I set this template part variable to be equal to blog, so that by the time it gets down here, it will look for a template file called loop-blog.php, which is this one here, and it would include that, and it would include this PHP code in here. Now, if it wasn't the blog category, if it was another category, then it would come through here and it go, if it is the category, yes it is. Then if it's not the blog category, then it's going to be one of my other categories, so the cats or the dogs category, in which case I set the template part to be category gallery. Okay, so those two other categories will use the same template part because they have the same layout. Okay, the way that they look is essentially the same, it's just the content that's different. So in that case, I set the template part variable to be category gallery, and by the time it gets down here, it includes the local template file loop-category gallery.php, so this one here, and it will output the content in essentially this alignment. Okay, the grid of post thumbnails with links to the full posts. Okay, and so on and so forth. So if it's and then this is how I select between either the loop front page template or the or any other page template. So the About Me page, for example. Okay, using a similar thing. So in this case, I'm testing actually the value of the title. So testing if the title of the item that's being clicked on is home, in which case I'll include the front page loop template part. Otherwise, the final thing will default to just including the loop page template part. Okay, so that section there, that's all about finding the correct loop template part to include in this line down here. And then after that, it's just a matter of outputting some HTML here. So I'm outputting a section element, I'm outputting an anchor tag, and I'll explain that in more detail in a moment. And then finally, what does the bulk of the actual HTML outputting is this part, which includes one of these loop template part files. And I've got that inside of a if has post condition, so that if there's no content to display, it doesn't bother loading the template part file. Otherwise we just get an empty section. Okay, so, and I guess this part down here, I could have done this as another big conditional statement, which alternatively had all of this loop, these loop template part files, all the code from that, I could have put in place of this here in a big conditional statement, but by splitting this up into different part files and including them here, it just keeps It just keeps it a lot cleaner, a lot neater, a lot easier to maintain. So basically between here and here, that's where all of the content for one of these sections is output. So that's a section, that's a section, that's a section. Okay, and we can look at we can inspect the code for this, and I can see, okay, there's all of my sections. Okay, section, 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 and inside of that, all of the content is being output for the actual individual little template part. Now I should explain a couple of things here. So you'll notice I've put in this section tag, I'm outputting the PHP body class, and that might seem like an odd thing to do anywhere other than the actual body tag. But the reason that I'm doing that is basically because I've taken what was multiple pages, multiple body sections, and put them all in the one page. And I used to rely on the body class at the top of this section to enable me to style it differently, different backgrounds for, and so forth. So what I've done now is I've output the body class on the section element that contains this part of the template, so that I can still rely on these classes that get output by that body tag function. So I can still style individual sections differently. Okay, and then this anchor tag here, this is actually so that when we click on any of these menu items, it knows where to scroll to. Okay, so basically at the top of every section, okay, there's going to be an anchor, and it's invisible, it doesn't have any content, but it has a name which equates to whatever the name of the link was that we've clicked on, and I'll show you how that links up in a moment. So this is a way that you may or may not be used to, but you can link the A tag. You've always been able to link externally by giving it an href, but also linking to any other anchor, any other A tag on the page by using this name variable, and that's what we're going to take advantage of to get this navigation working. So that's that template. So they're the main. That controls essentially what content is output and which template part is outputting the content. That's everything that this particular file does. Now the rest of the navigation is actually handled via JavaScript. So the difference between the navigation between here and what we used to have is that these don't link to external pages anymore. They link to those anchor tags within each section that we're outputting on the page. And we can get that to work without JavaScript necessarily, but JavaScript allows us to have this scrolling effect, which people like to have on this particular kind of page layout. So my JavaScript code for this I put inside of this JavaScript file called navigation.js. And if you're trying to find where I've included that file, you'll actually find that in my functions.php file. So down here I've got a function hook which uses the function wp register script to include that file like this. Now I could have put it in the header as a link to the JavaScript file here. I've done it this way because this is the way that WordPress recommends for basically avoiding various issues that I won't go into now, but that's where the JavaScript file is loading. If you want to look more into that, then look up this function wp register script in the WordPress documentation, but I won't say any more about that here. The important thing is basically what this navigation.js file does. So first of all, I've got everything within a WordPress compatible jQuery document.ready handler, which looks like this. Okay, and basically the important part of this file is this section here. So as I've said in this comment, this big long selector here is a jQuery selector, which basically says select all of the main menu items except for this one. So select anything that's not an external link, or what WordPress labels as a custom link type. So that jQuery selector selects all of those other links. And then it adds a click handler function to them, and inside of that click handler function, it's calling this other function that I've got set up called scroll to anchor, and it's passing a reference to the A tag on that menu item to this scroll to anchor function. And this scroll to anchor function essentially takes it takes an element, or it takes an anchor tag, a reference to an anchor tag, and then looks for another anchor tag which has the name attribute that's the same as the text content of that first anchor tag. Now that's a mouthful, but all that's really saying is when I click on one of these, get the text of this list item, and then go looking through the code. So let's say I click on this dogs one. Okay, it says go looking through, when I click on this it'll say go looking through the code for a anchor tag with a name attribute of dogs. And then I've got another bit of code which says scroll to that position. Okay, so if I look at the dogs here, okay, there is the anchor tag that I talked about before that I put in with the name of dogs. So the important thing is that there's an anchor tag there in the right place where I want it to scroll to, and it has a name attribute which is exactly the same as the text that's contained within the menu item that I've clicked. Okay, and that should work no matter what the name of the menu item is, as long as it's the same. And it should be the same, because back in my front page template file here, I'm outputting the name attribute based exactly on the text of the menu item. So even if I go and change the name of that menu item, this should still work without me having to modify the code. So that's what it does. It goes and looks for that anchor tag, and then this line here actually animates the scrolling to that new position. And then finally here, this is not really something that you have to do, but it's an optional extra. You'll notice without this, if I don't have this here, when I click on, I'll disable it just to show you what it looks like. There we go. Okay, if I don't have that code in there, when I click on one of these links, you'll notice that the URL stays the same here. And it's not a huge deal, but it means that we can't bookmark this page to be here. So that if I was to go back and refresh this, okay, it would, or if I was to go back and store this as a bookmark and then open it up later on, it's always going to open it up at the top here. Now if I keep that in, if I keep that code in, and this code is essentially modifying the browser history and the location bar of the text that's in the address bar here. If I keep that in, I refresh this, then you'll notice that it's modifying the address bar with the anchor tag that it's of the section that it's visiting. So if I was to then take that URL and paste it in a new tab, it should take me directly to that part of the page when it loads. So that's just an additional extra nice thing to have there. And then finally, the last bit here, this middle bit, is to handle this top link here. And it essentially does the same thing. It animates the body, but it just animates it back to the top of the page, and then modifies the location bar so that it's set back to the default URL. So if I had gone to a section here, I click top, it removes that back to its old, or its original URL for the home page. Now the last thing to mention in this JavaScript is you'll notice that these click handlers both have return false at the end. And as I say in the comment here, this is to stop the default linking behavior. If I get rid of these, okay, then, or if I just get rid of this one for the main navigation here, I'll refresh this page. If I inspect the code here, you'll notice that the links, they're still being output with the href, attribute here. So if I was to click on these normally, even with the JavaScript scrolling and everything, you'll notice that it actually loads up a new page. So it still has the original link to load up a category template. So the reason that we put return false at the end of there is to stop that from happening. So this way we can still have it, we can still have those links exist there. We don't have to do anything fancy to try and remove the href attributes, but we can still stop the page from redirecting to a new page like that, and we do that just by putting return false at the end of our click handlers. Okay, now this top link here, I should mention also that I have to make sure that I put that somewhere in the template. Okay, it just doesn't just appear by itself. So I've got this link here, and I've put it in the header because I want it to be essentially absolutely positioned. You'll notice as I scroll, it doesn't move. It stays hovering over the top. So to do that, I'm just putting it essentially in the highest. I'm just putting it, just following the body tag, but the important thing there is how I style this. So if I inspect this, okay, then you can see I've styled this on my style.css line 461, and the important thing is that I give it a fixed position so that it always stays in the same spot regardless of scrolling, and then I'm setting the Z index higher than anything else on the page. And so setting a Z index of 1 is sufficient for that. You can see if I don't set the Z index of 1, it disappears behind other content that might be at a higher Z index. So when I re-enable that, that's there. Okay, so that's pretty much everything there is to that. It's reasonably complex. There's quite a few interacting things there, but we should be able to take this example and, without too much modification, get it to work with any other type of menu or any other type of content that you might output. One thing I should mention is that in this example I've retained this lightbox effect from my previous lightbox post tutorial, and that's not to say that you have to have content like this. We could very easily have content which links to still a standalone template, as this does, and there's some issues with the styling, but the point is here that you can still use those other templates if you want to have content that's loaded not within this page, that's loaded in its own external page, but you can also have something like this lightbox overlay which loads new content again in this page along with all the other stuff. So it's quite flexible. You can do one or the other or both. It's up to you. There's nothing about this technique that stops you doing any of those other things as well. Okay, so I guess to end, I'll just recap the basic steps required to do this. So the main files that we're looking at is this frontpage.php file, and the first thing I do there is call this wp getNav menu items function, which returns me a list of objects that contain information about my main menu here. Now this variable here is important, that's what I've called my menu in the back end of WordPress. So as long as yours is called main, that should work. Then I loop through those menus. I have a bit of a conditional statement to determine the arguments that I want to send the custom query to get the right content back for each section. I create the custom query for this global WP query variable to modify the content that's being sent back to me. once I've got that, I can determine, depending on the content, which template part to include down here. And then I actually include the template with a little bit of wrapping HTML, and it will load in whatever template part is appropriate for that particular section. And then to get the navigation to work, the only other thing I have to add to this template file is an anchor here, which will basically be the point where when I click on the menu item it will scroll to, and I'm making sure that the name attribute is outputting the title of the menu item. Okay, so that menu item, whichever menu item it is at this point in the loop. Then I can have this navigation.js, which again, remembering, is included in the functions.php file here. Then I can have this where inside of my jQuery ready handler function, I have a jQuery selector which selects all of my main menu items that aren't a menu item type custom, that is everything but this one which goes to an external link. And I put a click handler function on that, and that will scroll to the anchor using this function here. We'll scroll to the anchor which relates to the name of this menu item. Okay, which should relate to the menu item because I've output the attribute name as the menu item title here. Okay, and then finally there's also the top link here. So this bit of JavaScript does the same thing, handles clicking on that and then scrolls to the top with the little additional bit of modifying the browser address bar to show either the original URL or the current anchor, depending on what we've clicked on, whether it's a menu item or the top link. And the last little bit was making sure that I had actually that top link somewhere, and I'd put it in the header of the file. I guess I didn't have to put it there. I could put it in my front page template if I want, but I put it there because it makes it easy to position it absolutely to the page or to the body section of the page. Okay, so they're the steps that you need to go through. Feel free to modify this example if you want. That's basically how you get a single page layout as a WordPress theme.